Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and welcome back for part 4 of my Great Guitar Build-Off video series. So part 3 ended with me gluing the neck into place, so this one's going to start with me carving in the transition between the neck and the body. I had deliberately left a whole big glue joint there so that I could carve away a whole bunch of it to make a nice, really smooth transition, almost like a neck through a guitar would have. So just roughly removing most of the material using an angle grinder and then coming in with some hand files to really refine the shape. I had originally thought about leaving that center part of it kind of pointy, but I changed my mind partway through and rounded it all off, and ultimately I think that was a good decision. It feels really nice. Here I'm drilling access for the output jack, just using a 7/8 inch Forstner bit. And then following that up with a step drill so that I can recess the jack plate into the body a little bit. So it's fair to say that burning guitars is horribly overdone, so that being said, I'm going to burn this guitar. But I'm going to only very selectively burn the open parts of the grain to open them up a little bit more. You'll see why later. I'm just using a torch with a very fine flame on it because I only want to burn the bits of open grain, and I'm trying not to burn any of the harder grain in between if I can avoid it. Though in some places that's difficult because the grain lines are so close together. So then I'm just going to go in with a wire brush and clean out any of the charred bits that are just hanging on. And then I'm going to follow that up by sanding the whole thing with 320 grit sandpaper on my random orbital sander. So I've done that, I'm going to come in with some black stain, and I'm going to stain the whole thing black. This will make sense soon, I swear. Well, there's obviously I'm not staining the neck or the front of the body. So once all of the black stain is on there, I'm going to take some metallic gold enamel modeling paint, and I'm going to start painting that into all of the open grain that I've opened up. Why am I using enamel modeling paint? Well, originally I had planned on using Crimson's grain enhancing filler, but as of the time of recording, US Customs has been holding onto it and preventing delivery for 19 days. So shoutouts to them for that. But this seemed to work relatively well as a replacement. Just the painstaking process of painting this into every single grain line on the back and sides of the body. It took a long time. So once I'm sure that all of the open grain has paint in it, I'm going to go in with my random orbital sander again, still with 320 grit paper, and I'm going to sand back all of the excess paint, and I'm also going to be sanding back a bit of the black stain. That's going to leave me with an interesting sort of three-tone color finish thing on the back here that I really like. Where it's got dark blacks, it's got lighter grays, and it's got the gold lines. And I'm sure a lot of people probably aren't going to like this, but I really like how it turned out. So now that I'm done doing that, I'm going to begin the finishing process. I'm going to start by applying some sanding sealer, just so I can get a really smooth surface once I'm all done with the finish. I'm applying the sanding sealer to the front of the headstock, the front, sides, and back of the body, but I'm not applying any of it to the neck. Now this is because I want the neck to have a different finish than the rest of the body. And because I plan on ultimately lacquering the body and the front of the headstock so that those parts match, but I want the neck to have a smoother, more natural feel, so that's why the neck is going to get an oil finish. But now that I've applied a couple coats of sanding sealer, I'm going to take some 320 grit sandpaper and I'm going to wet sand the whole body to just level all of that off, get it as smooth as I can, and then I'm going to begin applying lacquer. And you'll notice there I am applying a little bit of lacquer near the base of the neck. There is a reason for that, and you'll see shortly. Also applying lacquer to the back plates. So after the first applications of lacquer, you can see it looks like that. It's shiny but not very smooth, so I'm going to start working on that by, again, wet sanding, this time starting with 1000 grit sandpaper and then moving up to 1500. So then once I'm done with sanding, the body looks something like this. It's now very smooth, but it's not as shiny as it was. So that's where the next step comes in. At this point I'm going to be using some buffing compound, starting with a high cut buffing compound, which is going to remove any remaining scratches that are left from the sandpaper. And then I'm going to follow that up with an ultra finishing polish to make it nice and shiny. So there you can see now it is smooth and shiny. So now after all of that, it's time for me to finally stop putting off the fretwork. So I've already made sure that the neck is straight using a notched straight edge. Now I'm going to begin leveling the frets with the leveling beam, checking that they're all fine using the fret rocker, marking the tops, recrowning, and then polishing them up using various grits of sandpaper, some Scotch-Brite pads, and then onto some coarse and fine buffing wheels on my Dremel. Unfortunately, these buffing wheels do have a tendency to leave some little bits of gunk on the frets. They just don't look very good, so after I'm done with the buffing wheels, I'm going to clean off as much as I can with a brush, and then I'm going to clean the frets with some 4-0 steel wool, which is going to remove any of the polishing compound that's left on them and also leave them with a very shiny finish. So here I'm working on the transition between the finish on the neck and the finish on the body, like I had mentioned before. And since the neck was mostly taped off, there's a sharp line between raw wood and lacquer, and I don't want a sharp line to be there because you can really feel that. So I'm going to sand that back with some 320 grit sandpaper and try to create a smoother, more natural feeling transition from wood to lacquer. I'm going to try to move that transition closer to where the actual neck joint is. So once that's all done, I'm going to begin applying the Crimson Penetrating Guitar Finishing Oil onto the neck. And this is really going to make that flame figuring stand out. It's a very pretty neck. I'm also applying some to the fretboard. This oil is not specifically made for fretboards, but it's perfectly fine to use on them too. And here just applying a second coat of oil to the back of the neck. And then of course I'm going to wipe off any excess and make sure that none of it is dripping over to the front of the headstock. And then I leave it to cure. So after all that's cured, I'm going to begin applying the shielding paint to the control cavity. And to the inside of the backplate. And I'm also going to apply some on the inside of the pickup cavities. So now we get to assembly. I'm going to begin installing the tuners. I've already marked out exactly where I need to drill, and I can begin installing. And these are some burnt chrome finish guitar tuners. I only managed to find them from one company in the world, and they sell them for about $30, which doesn't give me a lot of confidence in their quality. And, you know, they kind of feel like $30 tuners. A lot of their moving parts are very stiff. But the reason I'm willing to use such cheap and probably low quality tuners on this guitar is because it has a locking nut. So these tuners really only need to be able to get the guitar into tune. They don't actually have to keep it in tune, because the locking nut is going to handle that. So now I'm attaching the claw for the Floyd Rose. I don't really have a specific order of operations for what's going on at this point. I'm just kind of running down the list of, you know, what's actually left to do in this build, and just kind of picking whichever one I feel like doing most at that point and doing that. So yeah, it's not necessary to put the tuners on before the claw. You can do that either way you wanted to. There I've just installed the electronics, and here's the pickups. It's a set of Cold Sweat humbuckers from bare knuckle pickups. Of course, with the burnt chrome finish, just like everything else on this guitar, with a few exceptions. Obviously, the toggle switch was not in burnt chrome because, you know, nobody makes those. Also, the strap locks were not in burnt chrome because nobody makes those either. So with the strap locks, I ended up using gold because that would match with the gold that's in the inlays, in the headstock, and the body. So here I've already wired it up. Mostly did that off camera because the way I wire guitars is slow and not interesting to watch. So here I was just testing to make sure the wiring's all working properly, which it was. And now I'm going to put on the back plate. Of course, gold screws to match because couldn't get burnt chrome screws. The flame maple back plates look really nice with the rest of that finish on the back. So here I'm installing the locking nut. It's a really nerve-wracking process to install this because that hole you have to drill into the neck for these screws it feels like you've barely got a millimeter left before that drill comes out the back of the neck. I'm installing the pegs for the Floyd Rose. You just slide right in there. And then the bridge sits nicely right into that recess that I cut for it. Now with the bridge in, I'm going to put in the springs. I'm going to put on the back plate. Yes, I know I probably need to adjust the strings later for setup. I'm putting the back plate on now for the sake of the video. So I'm just using a straight edge going between the notches in the nut and the bridge to make sure that the pickups are aligned properly and will sit under the strings exactly where I want them to, and then using a bit more tape to hold them in place while I drill the holes and then screw them down. Here I've got the knobs. Again, burnt chrome. Ultimately, I have to say the burnt chrome did not look as garish as I either hoped or feared on this build. It actually seems to fit the instrument quite well. So now moving on to the headstock, I'm going to put on the string retaining bar. I originally didn't think this was going to be necessary, but because the headstock break angle is so shallow, I wanted to make sure that the strings weren't going to cause any issues there between the locking nut and the tuners. So now I'm closing in on the end of the build here, just installing the strap locks, and then we'll be good to go. Everything is installed. It's somewhat interesting. I always install the strap locks last. In every guitar I make, it's the last thing I do, and it helps to have a certain thing that you always do last, because it gives you that feeling of, now it's done. Anyway, that does it for part 4 of my Great Guitar Build-Off video series. I've got one more to go, so I hope to see you around for the next one, and as always, thank you for watching.